Commander Vextal of the Galactic Coalition. Forces sat hunched in the medical bay aboard the retreat vessel. Last hope. His purple carapace still bore the char marks from humanity's latest impossible victory, the burns traced across his shell, like a map of defeat. Each mark telling a story of human defiance that shouldn't have been possible. Around him, wounded soldiers from 12 different species listened with growing unease as he prepared to share the tales that had haunted Coalition. Forces for 3 brutal years. A Thrakkery warrior with bandaged tentacles shifted uncomfortably in his biopod. 2 Zephyrian scouts, their crystalline wings cracked and dim, leaned forward despite their obvious pain. Even the massive Corellian heavy trooper, whose armor had been melted halfway through, stopped his constant grumbling to pay attention. The medical bay hummed with the quiet sounds of healing technology. But underneath it all was something else. Fear. Raw. Primal fear that had settled into the bones of every Coalition soldier who had faced the humans and lived to tell about it. You want to know why we're retreating? Vextal's voice carried the weight of defeat, each word heavy with the memory of battles that should have been victories. You want to know why the greatest military force in galactic history is running from a single backwater planet? Let me tell you about the humans. The Thrakkery warrior made a dismissive sound with his breathing slits. Commander, with respect, they're just another primitive species. We've conquered thousands of worlds. Makes these humans so different. Vextal's compound eyes fixed on the young soldier, and for a moment, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. That's exactly what we thought, soldier. That's exactly what got 47 fleet divisions destroyed. He stood slowly, his joints creaking from old wounds that the medical systems couldn't quite heal. Walking to the viewing port, he stared out at the stars rushing past in hyperspace, each point of light a reminder of the vast territory they were abandoning. The first encounter had seemed routine. Just another Tuesday, as the humans might say. A small blue world designated Earth, inhabited by a species that had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. Their ships looked like metal cans held together with hope and welding marks. Their weapons were crude projectile throwers that should have been useless against our energy shields. Vextal turned back to face his audience, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. The Coalition's expansion fleet expected standard resistance, a few orbital battles, some surface bombardments, and swift surrender. We had done it 10,000 times before, on 10,000 different worlds, had the playbook memorized. The Zephyrian scout interrupted, her voice like crystal chimes. But something went wrong? Everything went wrong, Vextal replied, but not in the way you think. The humans didn't have better weapons. They didn't have advanced technology we hadn't seen before. They didn't have some secret alliance with another galactic power. What they had was something far more dangerous. He paused, letting the suspense build.
Outside.
The stars continued their endless dance, but inside the medical bay, every soldier hung on his words. They had Corporal Juan. The name meant nothing to most of them, but Vextal saw a few veterans shift uncomfortably. They had heard whispers of the human defenders, stories that seemed too wild to be true. Juan was just a regular soldier. Number. Special training, no enhanced genetics, no advanced cybernetics, just a human male with a rifle and a squad of equally ordinary troops. But when our armored divisions rolled into his sector, expecting to crush all resistance in minutes, they found something that changed everything. Vextal began pacing, his claws clicking against the metal deck, while Coalition forces waited for the humans to recognize their hopeless position. Juan's unit had somehow turned a children's playground into a fortress that held off armored divisions for 6 days. 6 days. Our hover tanks, our plasma artillery, our orbital bombardment. Support? All of it stopped cold by a handful of humans hiding behind swings and slides. The Corellian heavy trooper laughed, a sound like grinding stones. Impossible. No playground could stop a division assault. That's what we thought, Vextal replied grimly. But Juan's people had done something we never expected. They had turned every piece of playground equipment into a weapon. The slide became a launcher for improvised explosives. The monkey bars became overhead cover for sniper positions. The sandbox became a minefield that our sensors couldn't detect because it was just sand and playground toys. He stopped pacing and faced them directly. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was their leader, a female named Nari. She was maybe 25 years old, barely out of training. When our negotiation team contacted her under a flag of truce, expecting the standard surrender protocols, she sent us a message that still gives me nightmares. The medical bay fell completely silent except for the hum of life support systems. Even the wounded soldiers seemed to hold their breath. She said they would fight us with rocks and bare hands if necessary. She said her people had a saying, "Live, free or die." We thought it was primitive bravado. We thought she was just trying to sound tough before inevitable surrender. Vextel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We were wrong about everything. The humans weren't bluffing, weren't posturing. They meant every single word, and they were prepared to prove it with their lives. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Every soldier present had seen species surrender when faced with overwhelming odds. It was logical, rational, expected. But these humans seemed to operate by different rules entirely. "How many did you lose?" asked the Thrakari warrior. His dismissive tone now replaced with genuine concern. Vextel looked out at the stars again. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ghosts. In that first battle, 3 full divisions. 12,000 of our best soldiers. All stopped by 37 humans in a children's playground. He turned back to face them, and in his compound eyes, they could see the reflection of flames that had burned 3 years ago but still haunted his dreams. And that was just the beginning. The Battle of Kepler 4-4b had been intended as a demonstration of coalition superiority. High Command had specifically chosen this human colony to make an example. They wanted to show the galaxy what happened when primitive species dared to resist the coalition's expansion. The plan was simple and brutal. Overwhelming force, advanced technology, and tactical precision should have crushed human resistance within hours. Vextel's voice grew darker as he continued his tale. We brought everything we had. Plasma artillery that could melt through starship hulls. Hover tanks with shields that could deflect nuclear blasts. Orbital bombardment platforms that could crack continents against 30,000 human colonists. With farming equipment and hunting rifles, the wounded soldiers in the medical bay shifted uncomfortably. They had all heard the official reports, but hearing it from someone who was actually there made it real in a way that data files never could. The humans had no orbital defenses, no shield generators, no antimatter weapons. They had tractors and combines and tools for growing food. We expected them to surrender before the first shot was fired. Instead, they sent us a message that still haunts my dreams. Vextel paused, his compound eyes reflecting the harsh medical bay lighting. The message was from their colony leader, a farmer named Junho. He said, "We came here to build something better. If you want to destroy it, you'll have to kill every single one of us first." Then he cut the communication. The Thrakari warrior made a skeptical sound. Brave words from someone facing impossible odds. "That's what we thought too," Vextel replied grimly. "So we started with a show of force, light bombardment of empty areas, just to demonstrate our power. We expected panic, chaos, surrender. Instead, every human in that colony picked up a weapon and marched to defensive positions like they were going to work in the fields." He began pacing again, his claws clicking against the deck plating. The attack began at dawn. Our forces descended. Like a storm, expecting to sweep through their defenses in minutes. Instead, we found ourselves in a nightmare that lasted 3 days and 3 nights. Vextel stopped at the viewport, staring out at the rushing stars. I was positioned on a ridge overlooking the main battle zone, coordinating artillery strikes through my targeting scope. That's when I saw something that changed everything I thought I knew about warfare. The medical bay fell silent, except for the hum of life support systems. Even the automated healing units seemed to quiet down, as if they too were listening to the commander's tale. There was a human soldier named Do Yoon, just a regular colonist, maybe a mechanic or a technician in peacetime. A plasma blast had taken his left arm off completely, cauterized the wound instantly. Any sane being would have retreated for medical treatment. Any rational soldier would have fallen back to regroup. Vextal's voice dropped to almost a whisper. He died. Instead, Doyan used his own blood to mark targets for his remaining squad members. He couldn't hold a rifle anymore, so he became a forward observer, painting coalition positions with his blood so his teammates could see them through the smoke and chaos. He kept fighting for 6 hours with that wound, directing fire, coordinating movements, never once considering retreat. The Zephyrian scout's crystal wings flickered with distress. That's impossible. The blood loss alone should have killed him. Human biology is different than ours, Vextal explained. They have redundant systems, backup processes, emergency protocols built into their bodies that let them keep functioning long after they should be dead. But it's not just biology. It's something else, something we didn't understand. He resumed pacing, his movements agitated now. The human medic Yuna was even worse. She crawled through active plasma fire to reach wounded comrades, her medical kit strapped to her back even as energy bolts scorched the ground around her. Plasma fire that could melt through our armor, and she crawled through it like it was rain. The Carillion heavy trooper leaned forward. Armor must have been specially designed. She wasn't wearing armor, Vextal said quietly. None of them were. They had farming clothes and hunting gear. But Yuna crawled through that plasma storm because her friends were hurt, and that was more important to her than her own life. Saved 14 human soldiers that day, pulling them out of kill zones while our weapons lit up the sky around her. The medical bay seemed to grow colder as the implications sank in. Every species in the coalition had survival instincts, self-preservation protocols that kicked in when faced with certain death. But these humans seemed to operate by completely different rules. Their captain Minho was shot 17 times. Vextal's voice dropped to a whisper. 17 times. Energy blasts that would have vaporized any of our soldiers. The first shot took out his left leg. The second shattered his right shoulder. The third burned through his stomach. He stopped pacing and faced his audience directly. Any of our species would have been dead after the first 3 hits. But Minho kept issuing orders, kept coordinating his troops, kept fighting for another 4 hours. He was propped up against a wall, blood pooling around him. And he was still directing the defense when we finally brought down the entire building on top of him. The Thrakkari warriors' breathing slits fluttered with distress. What kind of species fights like that? A species that doesn't know how to quit, Vextal replied. The coalition had expected the humans to surrender when faced with certain death. It's rational, logical, expected. Every intelligent species knows when to cut their losses. But these humans seemed to view death as merely another tactical challenge to overcome. He walked to a medical console and called up a holographic display showing the battle zone. The devastation was complete, but the casualty reports told a different story than anyone expected. Private Sumin had held a choke point alone for 4 hours after her entire squad was eliminated. She was using nothing but salvaged coalition weapons and an apparently infinite supply of improvised explosives. Our forces kept trying to advance through her position, and she kept stopping them with devices made from farming equipment and mining. Charges. The hologram showed a narrow canyon between 2 buildings, littered with destroyed coalition vehicles and equipment. When our forces finally overran her position, they found she had rigged the entire area to detonate. 2 full companies, 800 of our best soldiers, taken out in her final act of defiance. Extel deactivated the hologram and turned back to his audience. The battle lasted 3 days. They had orbital superiority, numerical advantage, technological supremacy. We should have one in 3 hours. Instead, we found ourselves fighting an enemy that simply refused to acknowledge defeat. He sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. They don't fight like any species we've encountered. They fight like they've already accepted death and decided to make it as expensive as possible for their enemies. Every human soldier was worth 10 of ours, not because they were better equipped or better trained, but because they were willing to pay any price to protect what they loved. The medical bay fell silent as the wounded soldiers contemplated this revelation. They had all joined the coalition, expecting to fight rational enemies who would surrender when faced with superior force. But these humans seemed to operate by an entirely different set of rules. "How many did we lose?" asked the Zephyrian scout quietly. Vexta looked out at the stars again, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ghosts. "At Kepler 442b, 12,000 coalition soldiers against 30,000 human colonists." He paused, letting that sink in. "We won the battle eventually, but it cost us so much that it felt like defeat. And that's when we realized we weren't just fighting another primitive species. We were fighting something far more dangerous." The stars continued their endless dance outside the viewport. But inside the medical bay, the wounded soldiers began to understand why the mighty coalition was retreating from a single blue world at the edge of the galaxy. The siege of New Geneva had showcased humanity's most terrifying trait, their ability to adapt and innovate under impossible circumstances. Vextal's voice grew heavy with a mixture of respect and fear as he continued his tale. The wounded soldiers in the medical bay leaned closer, sensing that this story would be different from the others. New Geneva was supposed to be our masterpiece. Vextal began, his compound eyes reflecting the harsh lighting. High Command wanted to demonstrate the futility of human resistance. They deployed the Eternal Blockade, a siege formation that had never been broken in 2,000 years of galactic warfare. The Thrakari warrior shifted in his biopod. The Eternal Blockade, it's impossible to break. The mathematics alone prove it. That's what we thought too, Vextal replied grimly. We positioned 12 battle cruisers in a perfect sphere around the colony. Energy nets that could stop a photon from escaping. Gravity mines that would crush any ship trying to break through. Sensor webs that could detect a single molecule of exhaust gas from 1,000,000 kilometers away. She stood and activated a holographic display showing the siege formation. The coalition ships formed a perfect geometric pattern around the human colony, their overlapping fields of fire creating an impenetrable cage of destruction. The humans had nowhere to run, no way to call for help, no advanced technology to break through our defenses. They were trapped with enough food and water for maybe 6 months. Our strategy was simple. Wait them out. Let hunger and desperation do our work for us. The Zephyrian scout's crystal wings flickered with curiosity. But something went wrong. Everything went wrong, Vextal said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Not in the way you think. The humans didn't try to break through our blockade. They didn't attempt to send distress signals. They didn't even try to negotiate. Instead, they did something that changed everything we thought we knew about warfare. He paused, letting the suspense build. They started building. The medical bay fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Every soldier present had heard stories about human ingenuity, but most had dismissed them as exaggerated tales from defeated commanders trying to save face. Within 2 weeks, a human engineer named Jiho had somehow converted mining equipment into functional spacecraft. Not just flying machines, but actual spacecraft capable of interplanetary travel. He used mining lasers as propulsion systems or haulers as hull sections, and processing computers as navigation systems. Vextal began pacing, his claws clicking against the deck plating. But that was just the beginning. His colleague Yunji had taken coalition plasma weapons that we had, abandoned after skirmishes, and not only reverse-engineered them, but improved their efficiency by 30%. 30%, our own weapons, made better by a human engineer using nothing but salvaged parts and determination. The Carillion heavy trooper laughed, but it was a nervous sound. Impossible. Those weapons took our scientists decades to perfect. Yunji did it in 3 days, Vextal replied quietly. 3 days, while under siege, while her people were starving, while coalition forces were pounding their defenses with artillery strikes every 6 hours. He stopped pacing and faced his audience directly. But the real nightmare began when we realized what they were doing with their everyday equipment. They turned their agricultural combines into mobile artillery platforms. Machines designed to harvest crops became weapons that could punch through our armor plating. The holographic display shifted, showing images that defied belief. Farming equipment bristling with improvised weapons, irrigation systems that had been converted into supply lines running through underground tunnels, children's toys modified with sensors and cameras to create surveillance networks. Their irrigation systems became supply lines that our sensors couldn't detect because they looked like water pipes. Their children's toys became surveillance drones that infiltrated our positions because they looked harmless. Even their food processing plants were converted into ammunition factories. Vextel's voice filled with grudging admiration. They turned their entire colony into a weapon. Every building, every vehicle, every piece of equipment was repurposed for war. But they did it so cleverly that our sensors couldn't tell the difference between a farming tool and a military weapon until it was too late. The Throckary warriors' breathing slits fluttered with distress. How is that possible? Our scanning technology is the most advanced in the galaxy, because they understood something we didn't, Vextal explained. They realized that the difference between a tool and a weapon isn't in the design. It's in the intention. A mining laser can cut through rock or through starship holes. A communications array can send messages or jam enemy signals. A water pump can move irrigation or hydraulic fluid for weapon systems. He activated another. A section of the holographic display, showing battle footage that still gave him nightmares. The breaking point came when Captain Hyanwu's unit launched a counterattack using weapons that shouldn't have existed. They had somehow weaponized their own atmospheric processors, creating a localized electromagnetic storm that disabled coalition ships for hundreds of kilometers. The medical bay grew cold as the implications sank in. Atmospheric processors were civilian equipment designed to make planets habitable for human colonization. The idea of turning them into weapons was beyond the imagination of any coalition strategist. The electromagnetic storm hit us without warning, Vextal continued, his voice trembling with the memory. Our shields went down, our weapon systems failed, our communication arrays burned out. For 6 hours, the entire blockade fleet was helpless, floating in space like debris. He walked to the viewport, staring out at the rushing stars. That's when Sergeant Bora's team struck. They had infiltrated coalition positions using modified environmental suits, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. They struck supply depots, communication arrays, and command posts with surgical precision, always staying one step ahead of our responses. The Zephyrian scout leaned forward. How could environmental suits provide stealth capabilities? Bora had modified them with adaptive camouflage, using materials from their mining operations, Vextal explained. The suits could change color and texture to match any surface. But more than that, they had figured out how to mask their heat, signatures, their electrical fields, even their biological emissions. He turned back to face his audience, and in his compound eyes, they could see the reflection of battles that had redefined warfare itself. Her team moved through our positions like they were invisible, planted explosives in our ammunition. Storage sabotaged our communication equipment and gathered intelligence on our defensive positions, all while wearing equipment designed for asteroid mining. The holographic display showed tactical maps that looked like something from a nightmare. Human forces moving through coalition positions without being detected, striking targets with impossible accuracy, then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. We had them completely surrounded, Vextal said bitterly. Superior numbers. Superior technology, superior position. We controlled the space around their planet, the orbital approaches, even the electromagnetic spectrum. But they treated our siege like a puzzle to be solved, and they solved it in ways that shouldn't have been possible. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The siege ended when human forces launched a coordinated breakout that utilized tactics no coalition computer had ever predicted. They used their improvised spacecraft to create a diversion in one sector, while Bora's stealth teams disabled our sensors in another. Then they launched their main assault using weapons that violated several laws of physics. The medical bay fell, silent as the wounded soldiers contemplated this revelation. They had all been trained to fight conventional enemies using conventional tactics, but these humans seemed to rewrite the rules of warfare with every battle. How many did we lose? Asked the Carillion heavy trooper quietly. Vextal looked out at the stars again. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of defeat. At New Geneva, 18,000 coalition soldiers and 7 capital ships. Against a human colony that was supposed to surrender without a fight. He turned back to his audience, and his next words chilled them to the bone. But the worst part wasn't the casualties. The worst part was realizing that everything we thought we knew about warfare was wrong. The humans had taken our own technology and made it better. They had turned civilian equipment into military weapons. They had solved tactical problems that our best strategists said were impossible. The stars continued their endless dance outside the viewport, but inside the medical bay. The wounded soldiers began to understand why the mighty coalition was retreating from a species that could turn farming equipment into weapons and mining tools into starships. And that, Vextal concluded, was when we realized we weren't just fighting another primitive species. We were fighting the most dangerous enemy in the galaxy, a species that could adapt to anything, overcome any obstacle, and innovate their way out of any situation, no matter how impossible it seemed. The liberation of Arcturus Station had revealed humanity's most disturbing capability, their ability to wage psychological warfare on a species-wide level. Vextal's voice grew darker as he prepared to share what he considered the most terrifying chapter of the human war. The wounded soldiers in the medical bay sensed the change in his tone, and even the automated medical systems seemed to quiet down, as if they too feared what was coming. Arcturus Station was supposed to be our greatest victory, Vextal began, his compound eyes reflecting the harsh medical bay lighting. The station controlled the hyperspace routes for 3 entire sectors. Capturing it would cut human supply lines and force them to surrender within months. The Thrakari warrior shifted, uncomfortably, in his biopod. I remember the reports. The station fell in less than 6 hours. That's right, Vextal nodded grimly. Coalition forces had captured the station easily. The humans had only a skeleton crew defending it, maybe 200 soldiers against our assault force of 50,000. Our battle cruisers disabled there, shields, our dropships landed without resistance, and our troops secured every section of the station before the humans could mount any serious defense. He stood and activated a holographic display showing the massive space station. It was a sprawling complex of interconnected modules, large enough to house 250,000 beings, with docking bays that could accommodate entire fleets. But holding it proved impossible against human resistance. And that's when we discovered something that changed everything we thought we knew about warfare. The humans hadn't been trying to defend the station. They had been studying us. The Zephyrian Scout's crystal wings flickered with confusion. Studying you? What do you mean? They had been watching us for months, Vextal explained, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Every battle, every skirmish, every interaction had been cataloging our behavior, our reactions, our instincts. They had been building psychological profiles of every coalition species, learning exactly what made us tick. He began pacing, his claws clicking against the deck plating. The human intelligence officer leading this operation was named Zhang. She wasn't a soldier, wasn't a warrior. She was a psychologist, a student of alien minds, and she had somehow compiled detailed psychological profiles of every coalition species in the galaxy. The medical bay fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Every soldier present had undergone psychological evaluation during their military training, but the idea of an enemy studying their entire species was beyond their comprehension. Working with her team, including analysts Tai Yang and Su Yang, they had crafted propaganda that exploited specific evolutionary fears and instincts. They didn't just understand how we thought. They understood why we thought that way. What ancient survival mechanisms drove our behavior. Vextal stopped pacing and faced his audience directly. It turned our own nature against us. They knew exactly which frequencies would cause panic in Thrakari troops, which colors would trigger aggressive responses in Zephyrian soldiers, which scents would make Carillion warriors abandon their posts. The Thrakari warriors' breathing, slits fluttered with distress. That's impossible. Those are hardwired instincts evolved over millions of years. Exactly, Vextal replied.
What?
and the humans had figured out how to exploit every single one of them. They broadcasted subsonic frequencies that triggered thoroughcry flight responses, making our bravest warriors flee in terror from empty corridors. They projected holographic displays in specific color combinations that made Zephyrian soldiers attack anything that moved, including their own allies. He activated another section of the holographic display showing internal station schematics. But the worst part was what they did to the Carillion heavy assault troops. They had somehow synthesized pheromones that mimicked the scent of Carillion. Predators, natural enemies that our species hadn't encountered for 10,000 years. The smell was so deeply embedded in our genetic memory that even our most experienced veterans couldn't fight the urge to run. The Carillion heavy trooper in the medical bay made a sound of disgust. Impossible. We conquered our homeworld's predators. Eons ago, the humans had studied our evolutionary history better than we understood it ourselves, Vextal explained. They knew about threats we had forgotten, fears we thought we had overcome. They weaponized millions of years of evolution against us. He walked to the viewport, staring out at the rushing stars. The humans had convinced 3 coalition species to turn against each other, using nothing but carefully crafted messages, and an understanding of alien psychology that seemed supernatural. Captain Kiwan had orchestrated a campaign that made coalition forces fear their own allies more than human enemies. The holographic display shifted, showing communication intercepts and propaganda broadcasts. The content looked harmless enough, but Vextal's explanation made it clear that every word, every image, every sound had been carefully designed to trigger specific psychological responses. They started with subtle messages embedded in our own communication networks. Private Diyun had infiltrated coalition communications, spreading disinformation that caused entire fleets to fire on each other. She made Thrakari commanders believe that Zephyrian forces were planning to abandon them in battle. She convinced Carillion warriors that their human prisoners were actually shape-shifting spies. The Zephyrian scout leaned forward.
How could
They infiltrate our secure networks, because they understood something we didn't, Vextal replied. They realized that the weakest part of any communication system isn't the technology. It's the psychology of the beings using it. Diyun didn't hack our computers, she hacked our minds. He turned back to face his audience, and in his compound eyes, they could see the reflection of battles that had been fought not with weapons, but with words and ideas. Her colleague Junho had created false intelligence reports that led coalition forces into carefully prepared ambushes. But these weren't just military deceptions. They were psychological operations designed to make us doubt everything we thought we knew about our own allies. The medical bay grew colder as the implications sank in. Every species in the coalition had different communication protocols, different command structures, different ways of thinking. But the humans had somehow figured out how to exploit all of them simultaneously. The breaking point came when coalition forces began receiving orders that seemed to come from their own command structure, but were actually crafted by human psychological operations specialists. Orders that played on species-specific fears and rivalries that turned allies against each other, that made everyone suspicious of everyone else. Vextal activated a final section of the holographic display, showing the station's internal security footage from the final hours of the siege. The images were disturbing. Coalition soldiers fighting each other in corridors, entire units abandoning their posts, commanders issuing contradictory orders while their troops looked on in confusion. They fought us not just as individuals, but as a collective intelligence, Vextal said, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. Every human seemed to know what every other human was thinking, feeling, planning. They moved like a single organism with a million bodies, coordinating their psychological operations with a precision that our best military planners couldn't match. The Thrakari warrior made a sound of disbelief. How is that possible? No species can achieve that level of coordination, because they weren't just coordinating military operations, Vextal explained. They were coordinating psychological operations. Every human on that station was both a soldier and a psychologist, both. A warrior and a student of alien minds. They shared information instantly, adapted their tactics in real time, and responded to our countermeasures before we even knew we were being manipulated. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The station fell when coalition forces, driven to paranoia and mistrust by human psychological warfare, began fighting among themselves instead of their true enemy. Thrakri troops opened fire on Zephyrian positions, convinced they were about to be betrayed. Carillion warriors abandoned their posts, fleeing from phantom predators that existed only in their genetic memory. The medical bay fell silent as the wounded soldiers contemplated this revelation. They'd all been trained to fight physical enemies using conventional weapons. But these humans had weaponized psychology itself, turning the coalition's own minds against them. "How many did we lose?" asked the Carillion heavy trooper quietly. Vextal looked out at the stars again. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a nightmare that had become reality. At Arcturus Station, 3,000 coalition soldiers. But not to human weapons, to human psychology. He turned back to his audience, and his next words chilled them to the bone. The humans never fired a single shot in the final battle. They didn't need to. They had turned us into our own worst enemies, made us so afraid of each other that we did their work for them. The stars continued their endless dance outside the viewport, but inside the medical bay, the wounded soldiers began to understand why the mighty coalition was retreating from a species that could turn minds into weapons, and psychology into warfare. And that, Vextal concluded, was when we realized we weren't just fighting another primitive species. We were fighting an enemy that understood us better than we understood ourselves, that could turn our own nature against us, that could make us destroy ourselves without lifting a finger. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the quiet hum of medical equipment and the distant sound of hyperspace engines carrying them away from the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever known. Vextal's final tale revealed why he was really sharing these stories. The Coalition's complete surrender was imminent, and he wanted his fellow soldiers to understand what they faced. His voice grew heavy with the weight of ultimate defeat as he prepared to share the most terrifying chapter of all. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels," Vextal began, his compound eyes reflecting the harsh medical bay lighting. "But classification doesn't matter anymore. Nothing matters anymore except that you understand what we're running from." The wounded soldiers in the medical bay leaned closer, sensing that this final story would explain everything. The Thrakari warriors' breathing slits fluttered nervously. Zephyrian scouts' crystal wings had gone completely dim. Even the massive Carillion heavy trooper had stopped his constant shifting and was listening intently. Operation Endgame was humanity's final gambit, Vextal continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Rather than accept negotiated peace, rather than surrender to superior numbers, rather than acknowledge the futility of their position, human forces had launched simultaneous attacks on every coalition stronghold across 17 star systems. He stood and activated the holographic display one final time. The star map showed the entire coalition territory, thousands of worlds connected by hyperspace routes that had taken millennia to establish. Red markers began appearing across the display, each one representing a simultaneous human assault. Led by General Wusung and coordinated by Admiral Yuna, the assault had utilized tactics and technologies that defied every assumption about warfare. They didn't just attack our military installations. They attacked everything that made our civilization possible. The display zoomed in on specific systems, showing the scope of the coordinated assault. Space stations burning, orbital platforms destroyed, entire fleets disabled or destroyed. But the most disturbing part was the precision of the attacks. "They hit us everywhere at once," Vextal said, his voice hollow with defeat. Not just military targets, but supply lines, communication networks, civilian infrastructure. They had somehow mapped our entire civilization and found every weakness, every critical system, every point of failure. The Thrakari warrior made a sound of disbelief. "Impossible. Our territory spans half the galaxy. No species could coordinate an assault of that magnitude." "That's what we thought too," Vextal replied grimly. But the humans had been preparing for this moment since the first day of the war. While we were fighting battles, they were studying our entire civilization. Every trade route, every communication relay, every power grid, every food distribution center. He began pacing his claws, clicking against the deck plating. Commander Biam had led the assault on the Coalition's primary fleet base at Rigel Prime, our most heavily defended installation. Protected by orbital fortresses and shield generators that could withstand supernova-level energy discharges, the holographic display showed the fleet base, a massive structure that had taken centuries to build and was considered absolutely impregnable. Then it showed the human attack, ships that seemed to phase in and out of normal space, appearing. Inside the defensive perimeter, without warning, Biam's forces used ships that seemed to phase in and out of normal space. They would appear inside our defensive perimeter, strike critical targets, then vanish before our weapons could lock onto them. Our sensors couldn't track them. Our shields couldn't stop them. Our weapons couldn't hit them. The Zephyrian Scout's crystal wings flickered with confusion. How is that possible? Our sensor technology can detect quantum fluctuations at the subatomic level. Because they weren't using technology we understood, Vextal explained. They had somehow figured out how to manipulate space-time itself, folding reality around their ships like a cloak. They could be in multiple locations simultaneously, strike from impossible angles, and disappear into dimensions we didn't even know existed. He stopped pacing and faced his audience directly. Captain Minge's forces had simultaneously struck 3 different worlds in the Vega system. 3 worlds, hundreds of light years apart, attacked at exactly the same moment by what appeared to be the same human fleet. The medical bay fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Every soldier present had been trained in the fundamentals of physics and warfare. But what Vextal was describing seemed to violate the basic laws of reality. The humans had somehow learned to be in multiple places at once. Vextal continued. Not just their ships, but their entire military force. They were fighting battles across 17 star systems simultaneously, coordinating their attacks with a precision that our best strategic computers couldn't match. He walked to the viewport, staring out at the rushing stars. But the most terrifying moment came when Lieutenant Hound delivered humanity's final ultimatum. She appeared on every communication channel in Coalition space simultaneously. Her message broadcast to every world, every ship, every soldier, and our entire civilization. The holographic display shifted, showing the young human officer who had delivered the message that ended the war. She looked ordinary enough, just another human soldier, but her words had shattered the Coalition's will to fight. The message was simple: complete withdrawal from human space, or face total war against a species that had no concept of acceptable losses. She didn't threaten us with destruction. She promised us extinction. Vextal's voice grew quieter, more. Haunted Hound explained that humanity had already calculated the cost of total war. They were prepared to sacrifice their entire species if necessary, but they would take the entire galaxy with them. Not as a threat, not as a bluff, but as a mathematical certainty. The Carillion heavy trooper leaned forward. Bluffing. No species would willingly face extinction. That's what we thought too, Vextal replied. So we tested them. We launched a limited counterattack on one of their outer colonies, thinking we could call their bluff. Within 6 hours, they had destroyed 3 Coalition worlds in retaliation. Not military targets. Civilian worlds. Billions of lives snuffed out in an instant. The medical bay grew cold as the implications sank in. Every species in the Coalition had rules of engagement, limits on acceptable casualties, lines they wouldn't cross. But the humans seemed to operate by completely different moral calculations. They had already decided that surrender was not an option, Vextal concluded. Not for them, not for us, not for anyone. They would fight until every human was dead, and they would take the entire galaxy with them if necessary. They had the technology to do it. He turned back to face his audience, and in his compound eyes, they could see the reflection of a species that had faced extinction and chosen to embrace it rather than submit. The Coalition's response had been immediate and unanimous, full withdrawal from human space. Not as a tactical retreat, but as a species preservation measure. High Command realized that we weren't just fighting another primitive species. We're fighting something that could end civilization itself. The holographic display showed the final phase of the war, coalition fleets retreating from every system, abandoning installations that had taken centuries to build, leaving behind territory that represented thousands of years of expansion and conquest. "We thought we were conquering another primitive world," Vextel said, rising from his chair. "Instead, we found something far more dangerous than any weapon or warship. We found a species that truly believes that freedom is worth any price, and that belief has made them unstoppable." He walked to the medical console and began shutting down the holographic display. "The humans didn't just defeat us militarily. They defeated us psychologically. They showed us what it means to face an enemy that would rather die than submit, that would rather destroy everything than accept defeat." The medical bay fell silent as the wounded soldiers contemplated this revelation. They had all joined the coalition expecting to fight rational enemies who would surrender when faced with superior force. But these humans had redefined the very concept of warfare itself. "How many did we lose in the end?" asked the Throckary warrior quietly. Vextel looked out at the stars one final time, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a civilization in retreat. "In Operation Endgame? 200,000 coalition soldiers and 47 battle fleets? But that's not the real cost. The real cost is that we lost our confidence, our certainty, our belief that we were the dominant force in the galaxy." The retreat vessel jumped to hyperspace, carrying the remnants of the coalition's once mighty fleet. Vextel's words echoed through the medical bay. "Remember this day. Remember what we learned, and pray we never have to face humanity again." The stars continued their endless dance outside the viewport, but inside the medical bay, the wounded soldiers finally understood why the mighty coalition was retreating. From a single blue world at the edge of the galaxy, the coalition had learned the hard way that some species should never be underestimated. Vextel concluded, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. "And that the most dangerous enemy is one that refuses to accept defeat, that would rather face extinction than submit to conquest." He moved toward the medical bay's exit, then paused at the doorway. "The humans taught us something that will haunt the coalition for generations to come. They showed us that there are some things more powerful than superior technology, more dangerous than overwhelming numbers, more terrifying than any weapon we can imagine." The wounded soldiers waited in silence for his final words. "They showed us what happens when you face a species that believes freedom is worth dying for, and that belief makes them willing to take the entire galaxy with them rather than surrender. That's not warfare. That's something far more dangerous. That's the human spirit, and it's the most terrifying force in the universe." The door closed behind him, leaving the wounded soldiers alone with their thoughts and the knowledge that they had faced something that would change the galaxy forever. *The END*.